Hello, Read 585, and thank you for joining me back for part 2 of this week's lecture. I will be highlighting some of the readings that you are doing this week as we are focused on using data to inform instruction, specifically assessment, what it is, what it should look like in the ideal sense. Our 2 objectives are for you to be able to collect summative and formative assessment data as needed for assignment 2 part 1. And then the second objective of this week is for you to analyze your data and determine instructional decisions warranted by the data. And you'll get some more information on how to do that in the week 5 readings. So chapter 8 of this ELA-ELD framework goes over a few things that I want to draw your attention to. First, this quote I think is really telling of kind of the shift that needs to be happening, is that student achievement depends on the skilled use of assessment information. So we want to be, data rich and information rich, not just data rich and information poor, as I shared with you last week. So what are we doing now that we've done all of this assessment? How are we using the information? How are we investing teachers? How are we providing them time and support to look at this data? How are we training them in really looking at the data to use it? And you don't need to be a mathematician to do this. You just need to be able to look at percentages, class averages, things like that. They do talk about formative and summative assessment data and give you some different examples of different types of assessment. So I would definitely pay attention to those sections. That will help you as you think about your data collection and analysis. They also talk about assessment cycles, short, medium, and long assessment cycles. Types and uses of assessment on page 827. There's a nice helpful figure on that actually, and information on how to look at the data. So specifically looking for patterns and trends. Interim assessments is another important topic, and I know more schools are wanting to either develop or utilize interim assessments because those are good kind of check-in points in between the beginning, middle, end of year assessments. There's also a lot of information on assessing English language learners, and that is an ever-growing population in our schools, so we want to better prepare ourselves to support them. So definitely look at that. And feedback is in there, as well as assessment for intervention. So those are some sections I would really direct your attention to, as I think they're some of the most informative, helpful ones, probably relevant for our purposes and just the bigger purpose of effectively utilizing assessment. The first article, Making the Most of Assessments to Inform Instruction. This article is based on classroom assessments, and they give you the following recommendations: that these should assess more than a single skill, so go beyond the narrow curriculum guides to assess a wide range of skills. They should be used formatively and then aligned with actual instruction. So we want to make sure that what we are assessing is actually what we've taught, and so that it is a direct measure of what has been taught. And then lastly, design multimodal assessment. So consider the format of the assessment: multimedia, digital, storytelling, bringing that in. And that's all I have to tell you about that, but actually I think you got this information last week as this slide snuck its way into the week 4 PowerPoint. So there you go again. Okay, the next article is one of my favorites: Are Assessment Data Really Driving Middle School Reading Instruction? What we can learn from one student's experience. So this is kind of a case study on a specific student. The problem is that we've seen so often that students might be good word callers, right? They can call out words with a high automaticity or rapid rate, but they're not able to read, understand, process textbooks with unfamiliar vocabulary vocabulary and increasingly complex text and ideas. There's a lot of high stakes assessments out there that are being used to identify students and put them in remedial reading classes. But those high stakes assessments, whether it be the old state test, which is what they used in this article, or Smarter Balanced Assessment, they aren't providing teachers with specific instructional information, which is why we got to be giving those diagnostic assessments. And, instead, teachers are sending students to instructional programs that are not appropriate for the student need. So they're not putting in place the instructional methods that match the needs of the student. So in this school, it is a middle school of about 1,000 students, 58% on free and reduced lunch. A lot of students are minority students, but then they also have a gifted magnet program. So there's kind of two extremes happening. So they didn't meet AYP, but they are considered an A school by the state. Their FCAT, which is their Florida state test, are at extreme ends. So they have, really high scores, likely from those gifted and magnet program, and then those low scores from the students that are not being serviced as best as possible. So the high student score is well or better than the highest students in the district, but then the lowest student score is well or lower than the lowest. So, that is kind of a unique challenge to this school, is how do we meet both of these extreme needs that are happening in our school, and they just have not been effective in doing so. And this article kind of examines why it is they haven't been effective. It's just interesting that per the state, they're an A school, yet are they really an A school? And kind of brings into question a lot of, how these school grades are assigned and the criteria for that. But the school implemented 3 research-based, they're calling it reading programs. One's a decoding program used with special ed students. Some of the programs are done by non-licensed staff members for 1 to 15 minutes during content area classes. So that's a concern. We definitely want to be having licensed staff members and our most qualified staff members working with those struggling or delayed readers. 1 to 15 minutes isn't very long for an intervention, and it should not be taking away from content area classes by any means. And then teachers were given a 2-day training on how to implement. So, 1 2-day training sit and get isn't always the most effective for professional learning. What's kind of the ongoing learning and development that's happening there? So just some questions to think about. So then they talk about the principal. He's worried that the teachers are losing their autonomy with the mandated programs. They want to implement elementary school environment that has learning centers, small group instruction, guided reading. And I know from experience, these are very powerful structures because they're more targeted and they're servicing students in smaller groups. So that's a good idea. And then also wants to train teachers to use test scores, not fear them. The teacher in this example has a PhD in conservation, is a certified teacher, but wasn't able to participate in the teacher training program, wants the students to experience success, but just really feels inundated with all of these professional development classes that he's having to attend. He really couldn't articulate his reading curriculum, the goals, or the assessments, which is a problem, but on the positive did volunteer to have the researcher come and observe and help in the classroom. So is willing to learn, but really, some of these big questions, you need to be able, as we've read in past articles, to really provide a rationale for what you're doing and why you're doing it. Because if not, why do you exist as a classroom teacher? The student is Jennifer. She's 6th grade in the teacher's science class. She refers to her class as a special class for students who don't do well in school. She doesn't feel it's a good place for her, but she does feel she gets a lot of help that other students do not. So kind of, a negative connotation feeling around this class she's in. She doesn't feel it's a good place for her, probably because it's like remedial reading skills, which she doesn't really need. She sees herself as a good reader and does read on her own. Many of her family members read. She feels school is boring. She has never looked at the textbook, and she said she passed the FCAT last year, but she did not. So she hasn't been given that feedback as to why she didn't pass, and nobody's really looked at why that might be. So she was assessed using many different assessments. The in-depth assessments found that she is reading with comprehension at the 4th or 5th grade level. So, not that far below grade level, yet still scored a 1, which is, significantly below or does not meet. The district has placed her in the phonics program at the beginning stage. So already you see the disconnect. If we're reading at 4th or 5th grade level, we definitely don't need phonics, as the teacher hasn't been trained in how to read the results of the in-depth assessments. She has been placed in a program that doesn't match her needs. And this is why we need all of you with your highly specialized training in schools to make this stop, this line of thinking of, oh, they didn't pass the state test, so they must need phonics, remedial reading, let's put them in that program. And now they're going to be having, negative thoughts about their performance as a reader and about their experience in school because they're bored and their needs are not being met. So really interesting article that makes you think about what are the assessment practices in your school? What are we using to make these high stakes decisions? Because they have very powerful and strong implications on the student. If you just think about this poor 6th grade girl, Jennifer, which, 6th grade in general is an awkward time for students, but then to be put in this remedial reading class that, I guess it gives her some support, but is definitely not what she needs. And how does that impact her self-perception, her attitude toward school, her attitude toward reading? I mean, there's just a huge snowball effect that can come from this. So definitely want to get you thinking about, in your school, how can you help support your administration and your leadership team to be making optimal but also valuable and effective decisions based on assessment data? What assessments are you using to make these decisions? It should not just be one measure, the Smarter Balanced assessment. It should be, maybe that is that assessment plus, another, some sort of leveled reading assessment that show you, okay, these students are truly behind in reading. Now we're going to go even further and give some diagnostic assessment data. So that should all be incorporated in your plan for your school for part 3. All right, so definitely wanted to keep this lecture on the shorter end to give you time to peruse your, 60 pages of reading this week, as well as to get part 1 done of your assignment. And hopefully by the end of this week, then you can say that you were able to collect your summative and formative assessment data, as well as analyze that data so that you can make some well-informed decisions about instruction for a specific subgroup of students. Who is that group going to be? What are you going to focus on with them? How are you going to develop the teacher expertise to better meet their needs? Because clearly, if the data is showing that whatever the subgroup is not performing to the same level as other subgroups, you need to think about that from the equity lens and ramp up your expectations of them and your support of them. So have a great week, everyone. Good luck getting that assignment submitted. I'm here if you need anything.